hundreds of years before Christ, and hundreds more after, Europe's indigenous tribes did battle. Their world was harsh and savage, in which survival was won by those with the deadliest weapons and the will to use them. Their tribal names exude a certain swagger to this very day. The Huns, Vandals, Goths, Saxons, Celts, and Franks. The Greeks and Romans branded them barbarians, considering them uncivilized, vile, more animal than human.
The term barbarian originally comes from the Greek, and it's what the Greeks called everybody who wasn't a Greek speaker. The Romans take it up, and they refer it to everybody that they considered to be non-Roman outside the empire. People themselves certainly didn't call themselves barbarians.
The so-called barbarians lived during the Iron Age, an era of war and emerging technologies, when metalsmiths forged the weapons that shaped Europe.
No matter when man has fought, there have been technological devices that he's used to increase his ability to fight. A club is better than the hands. A sword is better than a club. And in the case of the barbarians, we have actually very strong technology.
The British Museum in London plays host to barbarian weapons once wielded in the fury of combat. Among them is the 2,300-year-old Kirkburn sword. The sword was unearthed in 1987 from a gravesite in Kirkburn, Yorkshire. Its hilt was made of bronze, animal horn, and red glass. Its blade, nearly 3 feet long, was forged from the metal that changed the face of ancient combat, iron. It was crafted, and no doubt used with lethal efficiency, by one of history's most feared barbarian tribes, the Celts. In 800 BC, the Celts dominated much of Europe. By the 1st century, they had settled in Britain.
The Celts are a very obscure people because they date from pre-Roman times when we don't have historical records, so essentially we know about them from archaeology.
Archaeologists have discovered Celtic artifacts, showcasing the mastery of the culture's weapons makers. Hector Cole is a world-renowned ironsmith, skilled in the traditional methods used by Celtic swordmakers. Like his brethren before him, he relies on instinct as much as science.
When you put your metal in the fire, your mind goes in the fire with it. If it doesn't, then you will lose control of it. And a couple of degrees too high, and you will burn the metal and it's no good. A few degrees below, and the pieces of metal will not hammer together and become one.
The earliest Celt smiths forged weapons from bronze. By the 5th century BC, they were fashioning harder, stronger, deadlier arms, like the Kirkburn sword, from iron. Carefully working fire and bellows, Hector has heated a chunk of iron ore, extracting the iron into a catch basin below. He then molded the iron to form 3 sword-length billets. Hector now begins to fuse the billets together to make a blade.
I've taken the rocks from the ground and heated them and made them into iron. That in itself is magic. So you can see how these swords built up a reputation through their mysticism. And if it was a good sword was prized above anything else. So carrying on, you can see now it's starting to take shape.
The charcoal in which the iron billets heat up contains traces of carbon. The carbon acts as a hardening agent, and by pounding it into the iron, Hector produces steel. Up to a limit, the higher the carbon content, the stronger the steel. After the shaft cools, Hector hammers its sides, compacting the metal. The result is the kind of hard, powerful steel edge that bloodied and killed countless Celtic foes.
The Celtic sword was, on the whole, a slashing weapon, so that you were cutting. You didn't want to be sticking it into your opponent. You were battering them down, battering their shield down, and then slicing into them to immobilize them.
Finally, Hector forges a tongue, where an ornamental handle will slide atop the cold hard steel of the Celt's most prized killing tool. The Celtic sword was about 30 inches long. A rival weapon, the Roman gladius, was similar in length, but had a sharp-edged blade with a short pointed tip designed for stabbing. The Celtic sword featured a heavier blade, more effective for slashing.
60 hours of hard hammering, forging away, grinding, polishing, and getting a handle put on it. We now have a Celtic sword that is fit to give to any warrior to take into battle.
The Celts augmented their masterful weaponry with a unique system of defense. They devised ingenious fortified dwellings, many of which still slice into the English countryside. In Oswestry, England, lie the contours of a 2,600-year-old Celtic hill fort. A far cry from the era's classic square structures with towering walls. Seizing the high ground, the Celts used the natural topography of the land to their advantage.
We can see that the Celts chose this spot for the views, the fact that you can see all around of anybody coming to attack. And they have built a series of banks going all the way up to the top.
Oswestry was fortified around its perimeter with a series of earthen barriers. The lower mounds were crowned with a wooden palisade. The upper mounds were topped with stone walls. Atop the hill was a clearing where hundreds of Celts lived in thatched roof homes.
Not only have we got these multiple banks and ditches coming up through, but we've also got a bank which runs along the entrance on both sides of it, so that it cuts off anybody being able to get into the ditches, up onto the top of the banks and attack the hill fort in that way. So they have to come along that track down there.
Invaders who dared to attack through the front entrance soon became trapped in a two-sided free-fire killing zone. Those fortunate enough to battle their way through faced a fortified gate at the top. On each side of the gate waited yet another obstacle.
If you look at the bank in front of us here, it is still very steep, quite high, very steep. If you're attacking, then it's a considerable slope. You've got the stone wall on the top, possibly timber, but also you're going to have people up there throwing things at you, and that really does make it almost impossible to get up to the top.
Yet, despite the several layers of protection, Celtic hill forts were not impenetrable. In the early 1st century, the Roman army descended on the Celts and Britain.
In 43 AD, the Romans invade Britain under Claudius, the Emperor Claudius, and they face substantial opposition, but disunited opposition, because the Celtic tribes were not a single unit.
The Romans prevailed and occupied the island. After bristling for 20 years under Roman rule, Celtic warrior Queen Boudica led her people on a bloody revolt. Spear in hand, Boudica stormed into battle riding one of the finest examples of barbarian technology, the Celtic chariot.
The Celtic chariot becomes a very important part of their myth and their legends. These became very important symbols, not just war weapons, but symbols of greatness, of warrior greatness.
Here, I think we've got the lower jaw.
In 2001, archaeologists unearthed a grave containing remnants of a Celtic chariot that would answer a puzzling riddle about its technology. Experts had never been able to figure out how the chariot's wheels were secured to the axle. At the site, ground X-ray revealed a crucial clue: a J-shaped pin.
And this is the drawing that really...
Yes, of the axle.
The pin intrigued Mike Loades and Robert Herford, who were trying to construct an accurate, fully functional Celtic chariot. Their only chance to succeed was to solve the mystery of the pin's role.
And they were these J-shaped linchpins, quite an interesting shape. And associated with them in the grave was a little iron ring. Now, we puzzled for ages how this might have worked.
The solution came when research revealed that Celtic wheel makers cut a groove in their chariot axles.
So this J shape actually fits in the slot. Then this comes around that and ties to the ring, so keeping it in place.
The next step in construction was to form the charioteer's platform.
The platform is a lattice work, all made from a single strip of rawhide, and that gives tremendous spring. Most chariots in the world, you stand up on them. Whether it's an Egyptian chariot, an Assyrian chariot, a Roman racing chariot, or a Greek chariot, you stand. Because not only have you got some suspension in the plaited rawhide platform, but your legs are springs. So you're very much like a surfer riding a wave.
A Celtic chariot was built for two: an armed warrior who stood and a driver who sat. By itself, the platform's springy latticework wouldn't prevent either from being jostled by every bump and rut. But Loades believes the Celts incorporated another design element to ensure a smoother ride.
What if these Ys were straps, rawhide straps, and then the platform could be slung in these straps? Now you've got something that's got lateral and forward movement. It's tied off underneath so it's not too extreme, but it just gives a wonderfully suspended platform able to cover almost any terrain.
The Celtic chariot suspension no doubt enhanced its performance on the battlefield, where it may have been used much like today's armored personnel carriers.
The charioteers would take their warriors close to the front line and drop them off. The warrior would get off, and this is where he would come in and he would fight. So, after a few minutes, your charioteer would come racing round the line, and still at the gallop, you would get back onto your chariot, saying goodbye to the enemy, and have a break while another man was dropped off. Constant rotation of frontline troops.
And Queen Boudica? We left her leading the Celts in a pivotal battle against the Romans in AD 60. She counted on her superior chariots to overwhelm them. But barbarian technology in this case proved no match for the Empire's disciplined troops.
And as they gradually made their advance, Boudica's army was condensed into a smaller mass. And they got hemmed in and pressed in. The chariots couldn't maneuver, the warriors couldn't fight, and it was carnage. And she was wiped out, and her army was wiped out.
After the Roman invasion, the Celts are the settled native population of Britain, and they gradually become Romanized.
The mighty Romans had secured another conquest. But across the English Channel, other barbarian tribes were growing restless. One, wielding a fearsome new weapon, would one day threaten to topple the empire. By the end of the 4th century AD, Rome was disintegrating. Civil war and political upheaval had torn the vast empire in two. Meanwhile, the Germanic barbarian tribes in the north were being forced toward Rome by a new group of barbarians that had swept in from the steppes of Asia. They flooded into Europe on horseback, raiding and killing with swift and brutal efficiency. They called themselves the Huns. The Huns soon reached the Danube. On the other side of the river lay the Roman Empire.
The arrival of the Huns was a terrible shock. It was a shock to the Germanic peoples, it was a shock to the Romans. They also came with this formidable war technology.
The Huns came armed with an odd-looking, yet devastating weapon, the recurve bow. It featured horn-shaped tips and a curved shaft.
Out on the steppes, where there are very few trees, there's much less availability of that sort of raw material to make a bow out of. So they were forced, by what was available, to develop something else. And what they do is to take a thin lath of wood, instead of a chunk of tree, they take a thin lath of wood.
This signature Hun weapon was a marked contrast to the bow most commonly used in Europe. The Western longbow was carved from a single limb of a tree and was only as strong as the wood used to produce it. Its power came from its length and flexibility, allowing a deep draw. The shorter recurve Hun bow was made up of several layers of wood glued together against the grain. The horn-shaped tips made the bow curve back on itself, producing added torque and a quick snapping action. But which bow harnessed more power? Using a kind of sophisticated stopwatch called a chronograph, it's possible to compare the velocity of an arrow shot from each type of bow.
As you can see, there's a sensor at the front here and a sensor at the rear here. And as the arrow passes across the chronograph, switches the timing on as it passes the front one, switches it off again as it passes the rear one, and so the device will then record the velocity in feet per second. And as you see, it's showing the display that it's ready. So we'll try the Hun bow first. 107.4, so that's about 75 miles an hour. You must remember that the bows we're using here today are only about half as powerful as the ones they were using. So we could translate that up. The Hun bow might be reaching 100 miles an hour at the full power. So here we go with the longbow. 99.22 feet per second. That's about 68 miles an hour. And we can see that we've lost a fair bit of velocity there in proportion to the power of the bow. It shows that the Hun bow, with its faster action, its more efficient energy storing, its more efficient energy releasing, is punching that arrow out significantly higher velocity. And that's where the difference is going to lie.
When we get to the Hunnic bow, we're looking at a weapon that could penetrate some, if not much, of the armor of the individuals that were opposing them. Certainly the breastplates or the segmented or scale armors of the Romans could be penetrated because the metal was not thick, the leather underneath was not thick.
Beyond its superior power, the Hun bow held another advantage over the longbow. It could be fired from horseback with astounding precision.
Technology is not just for the killing, it's for the frightening aspect. And a Hun bearing down on somebody with a bow that he could fire with great accuracy from a very strong horse, the man who was likely to run away was defeated as much as the man who was penetrated by the arrow.
By AD 430, the Huns were following a new leader, Attila, the warrior synonymous with the term barbarian. He commanded thousands of battle-hardened archers, capable of striking with deadly accuracy. Their tactics introduced a new dimension to the battlefield.
The advantage for the Huns was simple: hit and run tactics. Quite simply being able to, within seconds, get yourself within bow range, within arrow range, fire off a quiver full of arrows, 20, 30, 40 arrows even, at an enemy which... reach you, and then disappearing again to fill your quiver.
The Hun bow was tailor-made for this hit-and-run style.
Unlike the longbow, the short and powerful Hun bow is very manoeuvrable, allowing it to be used from both sides of the horse, and also giving a great range of fire.
Historians still debate whether or not Hun horsemen used stirrups to help them keep their balance. If they did, their prowess on the battlefield could have only been enhanced.
The stirrup is vital for combat on horseback, absolutely vital. It allows you to distribute your weight over a much greater area on the horse's back, and it creates effectively a three-point fighting platform. You know, your feet and your butt. And this enables you with a bow to lean right forward, over to the side and back.
By 440, Attila's army had thundered through a wide swath of southern Europe. But as they moved west, they were slowed by an obstacle they never confronted on their native steppes.
The further into the forest and woodland they came, the less could they manoeuvre their horse archers at high speed.
The unaccustomed terrain wasn't the Huns' only problem. In 451 in Gaul, they clashed with the combined might of Roman legions and other barbarian tribes. The fearsome Huns fell at last. One of the barbarian tribes that helped defeat them was the Goths. They were destined to be the first barbarians to storm through the gates of Rome. When the marauding Huns tore through Europe in the 4th century, several barbarian tribes fled in their wake. One of the displaced tribes was the Goths. Driven to the border of the Roman Empire in AD 376, the Goths had no choice but to cut a deal with imperial officials. In exchange for asylum in Roman territory, they agreed to fight for the declining and divided empire. Under Rome's thumb, these barbarians proved they had more to offer than just military manpower. The Goths were renowned metallurgists who crafted intricate and ornate jewelry. And the coins they made reflected the same masterful workmanship they used to produce their weaponry.
They were particularly good at refining silver, so their coins had a value above what most people would have expected for silver coins at their time. The coins were about 98% pure silver.
Working from a sheet of silver, Goth coin makers began by striking round blanks with a hole punch.
Then you need a pair of dies. These are struck and made with tiny punches. And here the expression, to make money, hand over fist. And the coin is worth about $50. On the back of the coin is a small cross. The way that you get smaller currencies is by the simple procedure of using the cutting guide, the small cross in the middle of the coin, so that you cut the coin in half, achieving 2 half pennies.
While Goth coins have endured for centuries, few Goth weapons have survived. But scholars believe we can understand what the Goths wielded in battle by examining Roman weaponry, as the technology of the two cultures eventually merged.
The auxiliary units of the Roman army included people who were drawn from, quote, barbarian lands, and the customs that they brought with them, whether it was for decorating their weaponry or indeed the weapons themselves. Well, sometimes there's not very much difference, therefore, between the weapons that the Romans were using and the weapons that the barbarians were using.
Just as Roman arms makers copied the Goths copied the Romans.
They have adopted a lot of the ways of the Roman people, particularly armour. We have on the top here a riveted helmet. The 4th century saw a change in the way helmets are made. They're often made of segments which are then riveted together into a rigid armour. We've got the crest across the top here to protect against blows coming down from the side, and a movable neck piece at the back, and the nasal guard there, obviously protect the nose from chops.
Goth soldiers were clad in mail, the pliable metal body armor used in the Roman army before the birth of Christ.
Mail itself is just made from rings, which are, in this case, butted together, forming a very flexible suit of armor, which sword swipes and attacks and cuts just slide clean off of. Later on, we see an increasing amount of riveted mail, because the problem with this is a spear or an arrow can push the rings apart. It's fine on a cut, on a piercing action it can go clean through and push them apart.
As the decaying Roman Empire became increasingly fragmented, so too did the fields of battle. The imperial legions scattered, trying to hold the far-flung territories together. And the scope of military engagements shrank. Arms makers responded with weapons tailored for a more mobile soldier.
There seems to be, at least according to the records and according to some of the myths that come around, a lot more of individual fighting, one-on-one type of fighting.
Combat at closer quarters compelled Roman and Goth ironsmiths to produce fewer slashing-type swords and make more practical stabbing weapons.
A lot of the work, we think, at this time was done more with the tip than it was with most of the blade. Remember, even a blade made for fighting is still a considerable investment. So if you can use this more like a spear and thrust it into your enemy quickly, you can save the blade and subsequent work and so on that had to be done to it. The effects of this going into a person are quite shocking. So you've got the nerves and so on the skin, then you go into deep tissue or organs, and you're going to cause internal bleeding. You're going to take bits of fabric in there with you. It's just going to be a right mess.
The best way to kill him is to get in here and push up, because then you're going to get all the organs. You can't get past the rib cage. Only if you get a very slight angle you get it in there. But we know if you actually come up underneath, you'll damage all his organs. And we only know that you only need to go in that far to actually damage any of his organs. So the thrust upwards would be the killer thrust. Also the thrust down here, the main artery here. So you're trying to get in here and you're trying to get out there and under his arm, just here. You get in there an inch or so, there's a main artery and he's dead.
As the Goths and Romans modified their weaponry, their uneasy alliance deteriorated. In 377, just 1 year after sealing their pact with Rome, the Goths suffered a devastating famine, and Rome let them starve. The Goths revolted, unleashing their fury against the imperial army. Years of bloody conflict rocked the weakening empire.
So we are, 4th century, Goth versus Roman. Okay, and here we have the mail, my vest, protecting me against this shot. I've moved in close, so the edge just moves out against me.
By 395, the Goths were primed to deliver the death blow. Their new king, Alaric, marched his warriors toward the imperial capital. In 410, he and the Goths achieved the unthinkable. They swiped the jewel of the Roman Empire.
They take the city of Rome, but they do it essentially by cutting off the supplies of Rome. And therefore it was quite easy to starve it into submission. And eventually Rome, they open the gates, and Rome is sacked for the first time.
But occupying the city of Rome wasn't Alaric's ultimate goal. He wanted a Goth homeland, somewhere within the empire. 10 years after his shocking victory, officials of the dying empire finally granted him the first barbarian kingdom in southern Gaul. It was there that they encountered another tribe of barbarians, the Franks. Its warriors were masters of a small, deadly throwing axe called the Francisca.
They were weapons that could be launched from afar, like a javelin, but with a lot more power, and a power that was used by the fact that the axe turned on its axis as it was being thrown.
The first thing that this weapon is going to be able to do, it'll distract the opponent, at least. Take his eye off the fighting. If it gets through, even if it doesn't break the mail shirt, it will injure him, it will stop him from continuing in the battle. If you're lucky, if you're good, hit him in the head, hit him in the neck, break his head in two, cut it clean off. Really powerful, really brutal weapon.
Another strategic plus of the Francisca was its unpredictability. If you threw the axe to the ground at the proper angle, its lethal blade would ricochet wildly into the onrushing enemy.
It describes a kind of erratic loop through the air, which, when you're a defender, you're getting this kind of peculiar axe shape coming through. It's very hard to guess where it's going to hit you. Don't forget, this isn't just being thrown and then ignored. This is being followed by the angry man with it, who's now drawing another weapon to follow that axe.
The Francisca had an S-shaped curve at the top of its iron head, and the lower edge of the blade was rounded inward. The center of the axe head formed an angle of approximately 90 to 115 degrees to the handle. Most Francisca axe heads weighed between a ½ pound and 3 pounds, and their length varied between 5 and 12 inches.
Look at the shape of the head on this. Look how much weight there is, all at the head of the haft. What that means is it's very heavy up here. That way, even if you miss with the edge, you've still got a lot of power, a lot of weight there in a very small reach, so you can come in very, very fast indeed. Look at that. Straight through. Man's now without a shield. The next shot, that's him dead.
Wielding the Francisca, the Franks sliced through every barbarian tribe that challenged them, including the Goths. By the 6th century AD, all of Gaul was theirs. The Franks renamed the region, inspired by the lethal Francisca that helped them seize it. They called it Francia. Today, it's France. Across the English Channel, yet another barbarian tribe had stormed the shores of Britain, and they were making waves with their own battle technology. After the collapse of the Roman Empire in AD 410, its soldiers occupying Britain pulled out. Their withdrawal created a power vacuum. And as word spread across Europe, a number of barbarian tribes made the treacherous sea journey across the English Channel to claim their piece of the island. For years, the competing tribes battled for supremacy, until one, the Anglo-Saxons, emerged victorious. In the new British kingdom they established, their culture and religious beliefs prevailed.
They believed in a large group of gods who all had power. And they also seem to have believed that you needed to be buried with things to take with you to the afterlife.
In 1939, archaeologists unearthed Anglo-Saxon burial mounds in the town of Sutton Hoo. One of the graves contained the remains of a warrior next to the remnants of a ship. The discovery shed vivid new light on the militaristic culture he inhabited.
They saw not just a warrior of great renown, but a warrior of great renown whose entire accoutrement was still there. In fact, the rivets from the boat were still there, so they could actually see how large the boat was that he had been buried in.
Sutton Hoo yielded many weapons containing Iron Age metals. Gold wire decorated the warrior's sword. Bronze panels coated with tin lined his steel helmet. And an iron boss used to protect his hand capped his spectacular shield. All proof of his culture's mastery of metallurgy. When the Anglo-Saxons weren't duking it out on the battlefield, they lived in small villages scattered across England. In the center of each village was the mead hall, an oblong structure where the lord of the tribe conducted business and tipped a few flagons. Members of a reenactment group called Regia Anglorum have resurrected this bygone institution of Anglo-Saxon culture.
Behind me is a reconstruction of an Anglo-Saxon mead hall. An Anglo-Saxon mead hall is a place where the lord gathers his taxes, entertains guests, and in defensive crisis gathers his troops either to attack or to defend.
mead was a honey-sweetened alcoholic beverage that the Saxons drank to break the chill of the harsh English winters. It filled every cup during their pre-war rituals.
The drinking in the mead hall, the men drank together and swore pledges to each other that when the time came and the enemy came against them with spear and with shield, with point and edge, that they would be able to stand together in the shield war and fight together. The men that drank together fought together because they had said they would.
After the drinking came the call to arms.
On the walls, the weapons of the Lord and his warriors. We have the lightweight throwing javelin discharged at the enemy, the fighting spear with its sharp edge and point used overarm in conjunction with a shield.
The fighting spear had been a battlefield mainstay in Britain since the Celts first thumbed their noses at the Romans. You could always count on it to make its point.
Now to kill him from here, I'll probably look to get a spear into him as hard as I can, just keep going at him. I put a shield down, protect my body. After all, he is a trained killer and can cause me all sorts of mischief. And then a few thrusts to his face, perhaps even after that, a quick smash with the shield as I move on to continue the fight.
One difference between the Anglo-Saxon spears and earlier models was its spear point. Saxon metalworkers crafted it to inflict deeper and deadlier wounds.
If you look at this wonderfully made spear point, we recognize it's thinner at the point, it's even still sharp to a certain extent. This will penetrate the body and penetrate quite far into the body. The point where it probably won't go through, but will get stuck there. The individual's probably having to pull with all his might to get it out of the body as the flesh comes around this and circles around the smaller socket.
The most distinctive Saxon weapon was a single-edged knife called the sea-axe.
The sea-axe, or knife, the weapon for which the Saxons were named. A utility weapon, a general-purpose weapon, a weapon of war.
The Anglo-Saxons repelled every invader that dared to challenge them. Eventually, their pagan culture fell, not at the point of an enemy's sword, but as Christianity transformed Britain starting in the 7th century. Still, their legacy endures, in the form of the international language they left behind.
They were pretty good at what they did as far as weapons were concerned. Here we all are, we speak English. What better indication do you need of the fact that they were successful?
For nearly 1,500 years, the barbarian cultures had slashed their way into history. Battle after battle, they proved their weaponry was as effective as that of any foe. But what was the best weapon of the barbarian age? Surprisingly, the creators of a video game may have the answer. Imagine you're a barbarian. That'll be easier for some compared to others. What barbarian weapon would you carry into battle? Which was deadliest? Historians can only speculate. But the game designers at the Creative Assembly in England have devised a formula that rates the Iron Age's most lethal weapons against the defenses used to counter them. The results play out as bloody good fun in the animated game Barbarian Invasion.
We created a huge spreadsheet, and with that we actually kind of started to rank those weapons and shields compared to each other and the armour that they used, and then also on top of that we layered the actual skill of the people who were using those weapons and armour. And the result of that is that we ended up with a very, very complex network of connections.
For each weapon, designers calculated an attack value based on its capacity to penetrate defenses.
The very high attack rating means that it's more likely when it strikes somebody to knock them over and certainly to kill them than any other type of sword.
Take swords, for example. Designers rated the Roman gladius highly because it could cut effectively into armor. But they ranked the slashing Celtic sword even higher because of its added length.
The Celtic sword could inflict terrible damage. Swung by a strong man, it would probably take your head clean off, or it would split your head open.
While no other sword ranked higher than that of the Celts, the Hun bow emerged as one of the game's deadliest overall weapons.
It would be much more likely to kill a man, and therefore more likely as well to knock the person over, because obviously the strength of the bow, the killing power of the bow, relates to its velocity and its penetrative power.
A Hunnish bow would probably punch straight through most Roman armour. It's a very efficient weapon. It's got a good pull on it. It's got the kind of pull that you would expect from a modern sports bow.
Score one for Attila's gang. But the Hun bow lost points for a surprising reason. Its diminished performance in the rain.
The Hun bow was generally more vulnerable in the rain because it was made of composite materials, and so it wasn't as sturdy as a Western-style bow, which was a single piece of wood.
It's made of several layers of material. When it gets damp, the glue starts giving way that's holding the different layers together, and it actually starts delaminating.
On a rainy day, trash your Hun bow and grab what designers deemed was perhaps the deadliest weapon of all, despite its small size, the Francisca throwing axe.
With the Francisca, when it hits a man, we actually decided that it should have two types of value. Bashing value and penetration value. I can actually throw my weapon at the enemy, and that's going to cause them some harm. Then when it comes into close combat, I've also got the ability to block his blows. I've got the ability to fight hand to hand with somebody with a sword, and at the same time I can cause some pretty lethal wounds.
We've saddled the barbarians with a name that disparages their cultures and their contributions. But there's no denying the inventiveness of their weapons designers. Their ingenious arsenals powered the march of armies across Europe for century after century, in battles that helped determine the course of history. Not bad for a bunch of barbarians.